Psalm 2, it's, I don't know if you're familiar with Psalm 1, which you didn't read, but Psalm 1 is the one about the river outside Keys with the trees on the side. It's about the guy that how blessed is the person who trusts in the law of God and the Torah, and they are fruitful and they have wisdom in their life, all that stuff. And Psalm 1 and Psalm 2 together form a kind of introduction to the whole collection of what Psalms are. And this Psalm 2 is important because it introduces this theme of kingship. And there's a bunch of Psalms, you probably can remember some of them, or the idea, if not the specifics. There's a bunch of Psalms that are about the king, and they're praying for the king, or they're seeing the king as a picture of how God is. There's a lot of stuff about this kingship thing. And this one, Psalm 2, is it's a sort of a psalm of enthronement, because the bit where it says, today, where the king is saying to God, today I've heard you say to me, you are my son. That's about becoming king. So the point is that when Israel anoints a king, it's God saying, he's my son. Okay, we're obviously going to get to Jesus in a minute. But you don't have to pretend that there's any suspense involved in this. We're obviously going to get to Jesus. But let's stick with Israel for a minute. So it's the idea that the king is like God's son. But there's something really interesting for me. This is what happened to me this morning. I was reading this psalm, and I had this heretical thought. Not terrible heresy, but I suddenly thought, it's just not true, this psalm. Because it says about the king of Israel, about the other nations, I'll give you the nations of the earth as your inheritance, you'll break them with an iron rod and smash them like clay pots. And then it says, now then you kings, this is the other kings of other nations, act wisely, be warned, you rulers of the earth, serve the Lord with reverent fear and rejoice with trembling. Submit to God's royal son, for he will become angry, and you will be destroyed in the midst of all your activities, for his anger flares up in an instant. Now, what's interesting about this is, if this is a psalm that the people of Israel sang or recited when their king was enthroned, it never actually happened. Okay? Israel never became a dominant military force in their part of the world. In fact, they spent their whole life fighting against or being oppressed by different empires. Egypt, massively for the first 400? No, well, before that as well, because Egypt was always there anyway, for several centuries, Egypt, and then they got invaded by Assyria, then they had all the deal with Babylon, which was massive, and then after the Old Testament period, leading up to the New Testament, they were invaded again by Greece. That was horrible, because the Greeks were particularly mean. I like Greeks, but they didn't. And then we know all about the Romans. So Israel as a nation with a king spent its whole time being a small nation surrounded by much more powerful nations. So it's there's something weird going on here, because if you're a small nation surrounded by really powerful nations, it's a bit like who were we talking about? Oh, you were talking about pacifists. You're the pacifists, you're the vegans. You're sitting there cross-legged in your tent, lighting candles and eating tofu or something, and you are surrounded by nations with nuclear weapons and tanks and power, real power. And in the face of that, you recite a psalm that says, you lot better be careful, because if you make our king angry, he's going to smash you like a clay pot. It's a bit weird, isn't it? So there's something going on in this psalm that's really, really important, because either the psalm is talking nonsense and is just a kind of a fantasy, or God is trying to say something else through it. And you'll be pleased to know that God is trying to say something else through it. There is something in this which is really, really important. And what's going on is it's a picture of the kind of king that God is looking for. Now, there is a clue to it. I'm not going to go on for hours, by the way, so don't worry, this is not going to be forever. But there's a really interesting clue to it. If you look at the life of David and the life of Solomon, David and Solomon were the two most prosperous kings in the history of Israel. Okay, so when the people of Israel looked back, they looked back to David and Solomon as the deal. Okay, so most of the Psalms that talk about kingship have some kind of reference to either David or Solomon. So David was like the first king, the really amazing one that won all those military victories and established himself, and then Solomon took over from him. But the weird thing is, what's the most famous victory in David's life? Goliath. So in the most famous victory in his life, he wasn't stronger, he wasn't more powerful, he didn't have more weapons. In fact, he had nothing. He was a humble shepherd boy, and yet he brought down a giant. And even Solomon is interesting, because Solomon became one of the most famous kings in the world at his day. But what was he famous for?
Wisdom.
Wisdom. You see, he didn't establish a massive army. He did have some soldiers, but he wasn't a military force. He wasn't known as a great, powerful person. He was known as an incredibly wise king. So much so that the leaders of some of these empires came to see him.
And rich too.
Hmm?
And rich too.
Rich, he had a lot of money too, yes, that's true. He did. So he was known, but the reason he had so much money was because of his wisdom. He did incredible things. He had agricultural policies. He built cities. He was he was just very, very wise, and that's what set him apart. So what's interesting about this is, even though Psalm 2 talks about smashing clay pots and stuff, what it's hinting at is that there is a way of being a king in Israel that isn't about power and weapons and overwhelming people. In fact, that's why there are two rules there were two rules for the kings of Israel that are really, really interesting in retrospect that show that. One rule was never to count your troops. Do you know about that? In the nation of Israel, if a king counted his troops, he got into trouble with God. Because you're not supposed to know how powerful you are. Because it's not about power. The other thing was never have chariots. And the chariots are like nuclear weapons back in those days. Whoever had the chariot won. Because if you're on foot with a spear and someone's coming at you in a flipping Hummer, you're in trouble, kind of thing, you know. So they were told not to have chariots like the Egyptians, not to count the troops, not to rely on. So they're being taught all the time to have a different kind of power. So what's being talked about here is like a kind of soft power. The three things, I'll go back to this, the three things that the Psalms encourage the king to pursue are not military might or economic power or being cleverer or being more powerful than other people. It's intimacy with God, passion for the Torah, which is the law of God, and wisdom for life. So that's why Psalm 1 and Psalm 2 go together, because Psalm 1 says, blessed is the man who seeks after God, who follows the Torah, which is God's way, and who lives out of God's wisdom. And that's what Solomon did. It's what David did. David said, it's about my heart going up to God. So there's a whole picture. And what I realized reading this morning, I got excited about this. You don't actually have to, because I'm excited enough for all of us right now about this, was that I read this and I thought, that is true right through the Old Testament. Right through the Old Testament, God is saying, do not be like the nations around you. Don't rely on military power. Don't rely on your strength. Don't expect to always win. But discover that in faithfulness to me, you win by losing and you win by soft power. So there's this picture of a different kind of power. And I find that interesting because I think we make the mistake of thinking that the Old Testament is about the old kind of power and the New Testament is about a different kind of power. And we don't realize that all the time Jesus was saying to them, I will prove my strength to you, not when you are weak, when you're not powerful, when you are small, in the face of a greater power. Now, and then coming to the New Testament, so obviously this is fulfilled in Jesus. Jesus is the one who comes as the Messianic King. So the phrase from Psalm 2, you are my son, this day I have begotten you, I've made you my son, that said of the King, and until Jesus wasn't thought of as having anything to do with anything other than the King, is spoken over Jesus at his baptism. John the Baptist hears a voice saying, this is my beloved son in whom I'm well pleased. At his transfiguration, the disciples again hear a voice saying, this is my beloved son with whom I am pleased. Hebrews 5 quotes directly from the psalm to say, Jesus is the one who said, I am your son, you've made me your son. Acts 13, when they're recounting the story of the gospel, does it as well. So all the way through, there's the sense that Jesus is the one of whom it is said he is the Son of God. Now, this is the really interesting thing, for those of you who like a bit of biblical scholarship. In the context of the New Testament, that has nothing to do with the Trinity or Jesus being God. And I apologize for that, but it's true. Because the Jewish people, when they heard or when they wrote about Jesus, God said, you are my son, they're not saying he's Son of God in the sense we mean, they're saying he's the Messiah. Because you are my son is a messianic claim about the king. They're basically saying Jesus is the king that Psalm 2 is all about.